Very good, and good evening. And we're going to just do a really brief introduction to permaculture tonight. Just kind of give you the big picture, and maybe for some of you who are coming in the door thinking that that permaculture is only about growing food or composting. Maybe we'll get a little bit broader thought going tonight. I'm Alan Booker, and I'm the Executive Director and Principal Designer of the Institute of Integrated Regenerative Design. And I've been doing permaculture for about 20 years. And so what I'd like to do is to just take you through a little bit of my background for a second, and then kind of get into maybe a big picture introduction to permaculture. So, I actually graduated from Auburn back in 1990 with a degree in electrical engineering, and I went into the engineering field immediately, moved up to Huntsville, Alabama, and started working in large-scale computer architecture, cloud infrastructure, digital telecommunications, large-scale systems design, basically working on how the internet goes, making the backbone of the internet, and very large-scale systems. And it didn't take me very long to start realizing that a lot of what we were doing in terms of engineering and systems design was pretty profoundly destructive to the planet, and also not too healthy for people either. I sort of started to think about, why are we doing things the way we're doing, and are there better ways of doing them? And so, the picture in the upper left-hand corner is just like a picture of one small part of a lab that I designed and built. So that's sort of like how I got into the technical side and got to thinking about really not just how are we growing food, because that was a big question of mine, but also just how are we doing all human technology, and what's it doing to us as human beings, right? And it just so happened that I grew up really being outdoors, hiking, camping, been trained as a tracker, and the picture in the upper right-hand corner is a picture of some tracks. For those of you who have tracked any at all, you might recognize maybe that's a canine track. And if you're a little more experienced, you might figure out that's a red fox track. And if you're even more experienced, you might actually figure out exactly what that is. That it's an overstep walk with a turn, and but that sort of mindset really started me being very aware of what was happening to the natural ecosystems, and I started to notice that there were all kinds of things happening around me, that the amount of bird song I was hearing had been steadily going down since I was young, that the amount of insects that are around outdoors has been steadily going down. I remember when, at this time of year, if you went out for a drive for a couple hours, you came back and you had to clean the front of your car because it was just coated with insects. And today, I can drive from here down to a project that I'm doing in central Alabama 3 hours and have pretty much no insects on my car almost at all. And so these sorts of things really, started to hit me, and they started to have me ask the question, what happens if we keep on doing what we're doing, right? What's going to happen to the ecosystems that are sustaining us, that are allowing us to sort of live on the planet? And, I've also traveled an awful lot. I've been to a little over 40 countries and gotten to meet the people. And I'm the kind of traveler that likes to go and stay with the indigenous peoples and starting to understand their view of the world. If any of you recognize the picture in the lower left-hand corner, it's a baobab tree. It's an ancient baobab tree, and if you actually want to see scale, that's a Land Rover to the lower right of that tree, to show you how big around that tree is. And as I've traveled and gotten to see the way different people live on the earth, it started to really occur to me that there are profoundly different ways of living on the planet that are deeply human and also deeply regenerative. And those are, in many ways, when you live in those places, in those spaces, and in that way, you feel so much more alive. You feel so much more like a human being than when you're stuck in, an artificial bubble, staring at a computer all day, and that's your existence. So, I went off and started looking for people who understood how to solve some of these problems I was seeing, and what I wound up with was, narrowing the list down, because, being an engineer and needing and being very practically minded, I wasn't so much interested in a bunch of theories about how we were going to solve the problems. What I really wanted to see personally was people who were solving the problems that I could go and see the solutions happening. And when I brought that criteria up and started looking around, the people who emerged first and foremost were the permaculturists. They had real solutions happening in all the different major biomes on the planet on 6 different continents that I could look at. And, I could go and stand on the properties that they were working with and see the results. So, that was when, about 20 years ago, I got a hold of the Permaculture Designer's Manual and just started my own deep dive to understand what it was they were doing. And I've kind of gone from there. And so now I'm, in addition to normal engineering work, I have been for a while now, consulting and teaching in sustainable and regenerative design, using permaculture methods as really the foundation for that. And the picture in the lower right-hand corner is a off-grid aquaponics greenhouse that I did for a client, just one example, that grows food 12 months of the year, and also fish as a side product. And it is a closed cycle environment that is regenerative. So, these are the sorts of things that I'm thinking about now. How do we create these systems that create no waste, that are regenerative instead of degenerative, and that allow us to, be human beings in the full sense of the word, and actually live a full and engaging life. And that's something that I think it comes under the idea, as Joe was talking about earlier, that part of the ethics of permaculture is in caring for the people. And so not only do we need to think deeply about, what it means to sustain the ecosystems and to work with the ecosystems, we also need to think deeply about what it means to create technological environments and living environments that human beings actually thrive in, instead of merely exist or manage to. In some cases, some of the environments we put people into today, they definitely don't thrive, and they basically struggle to survive in some cases. And we have to do a lot better than that. I think the message is, when you start looking at permaculture design, we really can do a lot better than that. So there's a lot of different definitions of permaculture, and people, when they first start trying to get their head wrapped around what permaculture really is, they kind of go, well, why isn't there one good, solid, definition of permaculture? And I think the answer is that the biggest high-level overview of permaculture is that it is high-level systems design that engages with complex nonlinear dynamical systems. That's the fancy way of saying that, a complex nonlinear dynamical system, well, the biggest example we have of that is the Earth's ecosphere. The living biomes in which we are embedded as human beings. And so for a long time, our ancestors lived in that relationship. They were embedded in, the ecosystems that they inhabited, and they worked with them in a mutually symbiotic way. They were a keystone species, if you looked at it from an ecological standpoint, that actually created very important ecological benefits to the places they lived. And so if we start looking at it, well, let's go with Bill Mollison's, one of his definitions. He says, permaculture is a design system for creating sustainable human environments. And so, if you take that and you think about that for a second, you realize, wow, it didn't just say agriculture or horticulture. It didn't just say, waste management and recycling. It's talking about designing systems for sustainable human environments, which would include all human technologies, wouldn't it? So what's happened is that permaculture, for a lot of reasons we'll get into a little bit later, started and really focused on things like water and soil and food and sustainable buildings and so forth, because they're very foundational to really this goal of creating a sustainable human environment. But it doesn't end there. The tools of permaculture are actually equally applicable across a huge array. So it doesn't matter what you are majoring in, what you are thinking about as your career, it actually turns out that permaculture design methods have something very profound to say about everything. If you're in medicine, if you are in architecture, if you are in any field of engineering, if you're in business or in finance, there are branches of permaculture that actually are looking at and thinking about all of those things. But a lot of the most strong foundational work of permaculture has been done over the last few decades since it was founded in the early 1980s. A lot of that has been done around, we would call it more horticultural, silvipastoral, and working with systems and working with natural ecosystems. So another definition that Mollison used at one point in time, that I'll read you just because it's another good way of getting your head wrapped around. He says, permaculture is a conscious design and maintenance of cultivated ecosystems which have the diversity, stability, and resilience of natural ecosystems. It is a harmonious integration of landscape, people, and appropriate technologies, providing goods, shelter, and energy and other needs in a sustainable way. Permaculture is a philosophy and an approach to land use which works with natural rhythms and patterns, weaving together the elements of microclimate, annual and perennial plants, animals, water and soil management, and human needs into intricately connected and productive communities. So, there are a lot of different ways of defining permaculture because it is such a broad and powerful design system. I kind of think of it sometimes as being a comprehensive design science, because it really, the core of it, it is teaching you how to design these systems, whether it be a horticultural system or a waste stream system, or a cell phone, really, if you want to go that far with it. It's a comprehensive design science based on observation of natural ecosystems, and its goal is to create regenerative systems that support healthy human communities over a time scale of centuries. Because when you're dealing with natural ecosystems, if you're not thinking on that time scale, then you're not thinking on the time scale of the systems you're working with, are you? If you're working with systems that have trees, that have these other large, long scale elements in them, if you're not thinking about how things will go through succession over time, then you're not really thinking about the whole system and how it's going to go and what our great-great-grandchildren are going to inherit that we've built today. This picture, by the way, is a picture of Ben Falk's homestead in Vermont, and it's just one example of a homestead scale permaculture design in which the buildings are as sustainable and regenerative as possible. They're growing as much food as possible. They're regenerating the hydrology of the landscape. They're regenerating the soil. They're sequestering carbon. They're cleaning the air. They're cleaning the water. And they're providing an amazing aesthetic space for the people to live in and a healthy space for them to live in. So this is sort of an example of what it looks like to take permaculture and apply it on a homestead scale. People do sometimes use permaculture as simply another technique for farming or gardening. And it certainly can do that. And it's extremely powerful at that. But it's actually, if you take it at its broadest, a lot closer to applied systems thinking, done with a set of ethics that consider the long-term consequences of the design that you're doing. Couple little fun things. I'll point out a couple of fun things on pictures as we go. The birds on the upper right-hand corner, anybody recognize those? You probably recognize them as chickens, but I'll give bonus points to anybody who can recognize in the chat what actual breed of chickens those are. Those are some really amazing genetics that we're working with right now. And I'll tell that story maybe a little bit later, maybe when I do one of the weekend workshops. You know, so another thing you'll notice is that back when Mollison, when he was founding things and he was giving his definition, he used the word sustainable. But then when I gave the definition that I'm kind of working with a little bit more today, I changed over and used the word regenerative. And there's a definite reason for that. The first part is that the word sustainable has been hijacked and greenwashed a little bit. What started happening was that there were a lot of businesses out there that realized that there was a demand for and a big interest from people in you know, being able to work with systems that were sustainable. They wanted to buy products that were sustainably produced and that could be recycled. They wanted to be growing food from people who were growing it sustainably and so forth. And so they started to take over that term and really sort of, you know, market it and change what it meant. And today there's a lot of people talking about sustainable, doing things that are anything but sustainable. But there's another reason that we have moved from the word sustainable to regenerative, and it is, as those of us who've been working on this for a while have gotten deeper and deeper into thinking about what it's going to take to live on the planet for a long time, we've realized that aiming for sustainable is aiming for failure. And the reason for that is that we are talking about, as I said, a complex nonlinear dynamical system called the Earth's biosphere. And when we started looking at the threshold of sustainability, what we ended up with was shooting for the minimum threshold of what it would take for things not to collapse. That was what it kind of turned out to be, right? We want it to be sustainable. In other words, we want it to just basically not fall apart under, you know, under our feet, and for us to have, you know, deserts instead of forests as what covers the landmass of the earth, right? I think it was Derek Jensen that talked about humans moving across the landscape. He said, forests precede us and deserts dot our heels, right? We leave deserts behind us as we move across landscapes because we have collapsed ecosystem after ecosystem as we've moved forward. And so this idea that our metric of success is going to be nothing more than we don't destroy it more than we've already destroyed it, or we try to just aim only at no further destruction. Well, if you've ever worked with a complex system, if you ever worked with a garden, if you've ever worked with a farm, if you've ever worked with any kind of living system, is it possible to hold that in stasis? Is it possible to say, we're going to just hold it right here? And the answer is no, not really. You can't do that. Living, complex biological systems are always going somewhere. They're always moving in a direction. They're either moving in the direction you want them to go, or they're moving in a direction you don't want them to go. You're not going to be able to hold them in a stasis. And so really the only thing that is going to end up being sustainable is to think about how to be regenerative. And the word regenerative has a whole different idea behind it, right? And there's many different ways of drawing this. This is just a particular chart from Daniel Christian Wall that gives one way of looking at it, right? And he's saying, all right, we talk about systemic vitality either decreasing and increasing. We want, right? If you think about it, what do you want in the environment around you? I'm talking about not just the ecosystem, but like the human environment around you, right? The community of people around you. Do you want that to be increasing in vitality or decreasing in vitality? Well, our conventional practice has basically said, we're going to do only as much as required to be compliant with legal constraints, right? If there's regulations, we'll try to comply with those unless we can make more profit by ignoring them and paying the fees, which some people do, right? And so then we kind of got this, oh, we want to be green. Of course, that was a little bit of relative improvement. It was like a little bit better. And then we started getting the word sustainable, which, as I said, it was sort of that was that neutral point of not doing a lot more damage. And then they started going, well, okay, maybe what we need to do is, since we've decreased the carrying capacity of the planet, we've actually destroyed a lot of stuff. What if we are restorative, right? What if we try to restore and repair a little of the damage that we've done, right? Well, you can keep, but even that has problems, because what it does is it does not have human beings stepping back in as an integral part of natural ecosystems, working with them in a way that is mutually symbiotic, where we benefit each other, that natural ecosystems benefit us and we benefit them both by being there, right? And I've run into this over and over again when I've run into college students, high school students, who are sort of caught in this idea that you can do one of two things. They've kind of got this idea. You can either do business as usual and destroy the environment, and they're convinced that that's what we're going to do, or there are some radical environmentalists over on the other side who basically have bought into the lie that human beings are not supposed to be part of natural ecosystems, and that therefore the best thing that humans could do for the natural ecosystem would be to all just to die and go away, right? And just stop doing the damage. And so I run into people over and over again, that's their only thoughts about options. And that's pretty sad, right? So it's a pretty sad, like, what would you like? Column A or column B, right? We destroy the planet and die that way, or we kind of like just, go off and die on our own to keep the rest of the planet from being destroyed. I don't like either of those options. And the news that comes out of permaculture design and other regenerative design practices is there is a column C, and it's a lot more attractive. And it is regenerative design. It turns out that human beings are, by nature, an integral part of natural ecosystems. And there are example after example after example of humans working in natural ecosystems as keystone species that can move the regime of natural ecosystems over to being regenerative. As a matter of fact, we've now done so much damage to the Earth's biosphere that the only way we're going to get it back really in any time frame that we're interested in is to redesign the project of human civilization to go from being degenerative to being regenerative. And the folks that I've talked to that are other regenerative design experts believe that we could pretty much get it all back in probably 60 to 80 years if it became the way that humans decided they were going to live on the planet. We could regenerate. Now, everything wouldn't be back up at 100% because forests can take, climax forests can take hundreds of years to regenerate. But in terms of getting everything turned around and moving in a fundamentally positive way, we could be there in a handful of decades. Probably within the lifespan of some of you who are on this call. Having things fundamentally on their way to repair, having climate restabilized, having the hydrology of the planet restabilized, the desertification of large portions of the planet reversed, right? That is very possible, and that is the project of systems like permaculture to take on that challenge. So, we started off with, yes, we need to compost, and, yes, we need to be growing food in a good way. But what it turns out is that in reality, if we were doing what we needed to be doing, we should be sending this message to literally every student at Auburn University, right? Because every one of them, regardless of what they're majoring in, is involved in the design of human civilization. They're, whether you're in agriculture or engineering or in architecture or in business or in medicine or music or whatever, right? The arts, they're all involved in this project of designing human civilization. And if they understand that there is this option, and that they, through the way they apply what they are going to do with their education, can contribute in positive ways to that, then that to me is one of the most hopeful messages that I think you could give. So my question would be, why not take this message and, take it and not just go tracking down the people who maybe are majoring in agricultural sciences or ecological sciences or whatever, but literally, take that particular idea to the whole breadth of intellectual inquiry that's going on there at the university. And I think that is what we need to be doing if we're really going to think about how to address the problems that we're facing, that so many people seem to be convinced are almost insurmountable, right? One of the big things, core ideas of permaculture, is to learn to build regenerative systems by working with nature and observing natural systems. One of the big Mollisonian principles, named after Bill Mollison, the founder of permaculture, is work with nature, not against it. And the corollary to that is, if you try to fight nature, in the end, you won't win. That's never happened before. Humans have never won. Nature's always won in the end, right? What that means is that permaculture thinks about whole systems. And so the way I think about that is, as a permaculture designer and as a regenerative designer, I am looking at doing for human ecosystems what an architect does for a building. That is, looking at and thinking about and conceptualizing the way the whole thing goes together, how the whole thing works. An architect doing a large building may have a lot of people working with him or her. They may have, mechanical engineers, and HVAC engineers, and civil engineers, and landscape architects, and urban planners, and all kinds of other people working with them, electrical engineers, and so on and so forth. And they are looking at how all those systems are going to combine into a coherent whole system that works together. And as a permaculture designer, whatever you're working on, that's kind of what you're looking at. If you're looking at a homestead, then you're looking at that scale, or you're looking at a farm, and you're looking at how all the different elements work together. And one of the really powerful things that permaculture looks at is how to take and interconnect elements of a system so they support each other. So they become an ecosystem. So we're building ecosystems. We're taking all the different elements that in a lot of systems that humans have done so far are isolated subsystems sitting in different places, not connected to each other in any beneficial way. And we're thinking about how to organize them so that outputs of one system become inputs to another system, so that instead of that output becoming a waste, it becomes a nutrient for the next system. So we're building these webs of interconnection. And we know from studying ecology that when we build webs of interconnection, that we build resilience. That resilient ecosystems, the best way to measure them is to look at the number of beneficial interrelationships between elements in the system. And this is part of the core thinking of permaculture, is how to integrate instead of segregate. So that is one of the highest value pieces of permaculture. It brings it to any project it attacks at any scale, whether you're designing your backyard or whether we're designing an entire new community, or we're designing overhauling a city, which we've had to do. It brings this holistic and integrated approach, this idea that all the different parts have to work together in these mutually beneficial ways. So it's centered around integrating a system being designed properly into the larger landscape. It's almost more interested in the interconnections and relationships between the elements in the system than it is in the individual elements themselves, because in a lot of cases, those elements can be taken out and replaced. if the web of interrelationships is maintained. If this sounds like a sophisticated design scheme, it's because it is. And it's very powerful. A couple little examples. This is Jeff Lawton. He is with the Permaculture Research Institute of Australia. He sort of inherited the Permaculture Research Institute of Australia from Bill Mollison. Bill Mollison was the co-originator of permaculture along with David Holmgren. And so Jeff was kind of his hand-picked successor. And actually, I did my permaculture design certification with Jeff, and also my teacher training with Jeff. And he is one of the well-known permaculture practitioners that has done permaculture projects in dozens of countries around the world, and a lot of amazing things. He became a lot better known when somebody did a little YouTube video called Greening the Desert. If you want to afterwards, I think it's still available on YouTube. You can go and just search for Greening the Desert. It's like a 4 or 5 minute little video. And what he was given was in Jordan, in the Dead Sea Valley, 200 meters below sea level, not too far from the Dead Sea. He was given a piece of property which was salted hardpan. Okay, so I'm trying to think of anybody on the call who's grown anything. Let's think about this for 1 second, right? How much rain or rainfall do you get in the site? Well, the site gets maybe 8 inches of rain a year. It's in the Dead Sea Valley, 200 meters below sea level. There is no soil. It is dirt. That is, there's really no living microbiome. It's hardpan, which means that if you take a penetrometer, you're probably going to find at least 500 psi to get into the soil. And it's salted. As a matter of fact, if you see, as they're plowing up here, this picture on the left, you can see the salt. You see it in the furrow there that they're doing? Yeah. So this is about the hardest place you can imagine. Imagine if as your horticulture project, you were like, okay, this is your site. You got to get something growing here, and we want you to grow food here, right? Go to it. But that was what Jeff inherited, and he wanted that site because he wanted to prove what was possible if you applied permaculture methodology to solving the problem. And I won't walk through everything he did because it would take a little bit, but what you can actually see is because he knew he needed to capture every bit of water possible, he's putting in swales. He's putting in earthworks. He used hardy desert pioneer plants to be able to start to create self-shading systems, to be able to regenerate the soil microbiome. He used deep mulch from adjacent fields that had been synthetically irrigated. They were going to just cut it all down and burn it off. And he said, no, give that to me. He took it and he put it in the swales and used very deep mulching to be able to hold the water in. He used some other very advanced techniques, which really, if you learn them, not that horribly advanced. They're just a lot of common sense. And what you see on the right is a picture of the same site, the same place, about 8 to 9 months later. Yes, there's trees growing that tall because you're in a place where you get an awful lot of sunlight. And when the University of Amman, Jordan, figured out he was doing this, they figured he's got to be just using all kinds of irrigation water and washing the salt down into the lower, in order to get rid of the salt, right? And he must have used all this water, but Jeff had been keeping very careful records of his water usage. And he had used about 1/4 of the water that would normally be used to take and establish a site like this. And his water usage was going down. So there's no way he had washed the water through. He had actually locked it up in the carbon matrix. It had been locked up in organic matter and had become chemically inert. And he was growing figs and dates. And within a year, he had fig trees with fruit on them in this site. So he was using techniques like swales. And you can go watch that video, just to get a little idea of that set of design techniques to give you an idea of what we can do when we start to take and do whole systems design and work with the ecology. Another one of my teachers that I've worked with is Sepp Holzer. He is an Austrian mountain farmer. And there's all kinds of amazing things that Sepp has been doing. I'll just give you one little project. He took and created this amazing farm. He inherited this farm from his father. It was called the Regenerative in Austria, and he completely overdid and redid it. And there are some videos out there you can go watch of what he did to that place. Absolutely amazing. He was growing citrus outdoors in alpine tundra. Okay, not tundra quite, but he's up such a high elevation that it's almost like a conifer desert up there. It's up so high in the Austrian Alps, and all these techniques he's using, pretty amazing stuff. Well, what ended up happening was the people in Tamera, Portugal, at the Tamera project, basically said, Portugal is desertifying, it's turning into desert. And this is a picture of their site. They called Sepp, who had, been working in non-desert areas, but he came in and just basically applied permaculture techniques to this site. And he basically looked at this whole thing, and he said, this whole place is turning to desert because it's a positive feedback loop. You don't have any, you're not capturing and storing the water. You are not, so you have a negative hydrological cycle. It's all just spinning downhill. So instead of just trying to deal with it being a desert, he said, well, let's fix it. Now I want you to notice before I go to the after shot, because this is the patented before and after picture. Notice the tent structure, the white tent structure in the upper left-hand corner of this slide. Okay, and it's still going to be in the next slide. It'll give you a little bit of an idea of what just happened. Okay, there you go. That's about 4 years later. Basically what happened was, and by the way, if you think they're pumping water out of the ground to fill this up, no. Every bit of this is done with rainwater and stormwater runoff. And the people who were downhill, when they saw that they were putting this huge thing in, well, the first thing is they laughed at them and said, there's no way that's going to fill up with water. The second thing they said is, and if it does, you're trapping all of our water. You're going to take the water that normally runs downhill at us, and you're not going to get it anymore. You're gonna grab all of it. And Sepp told them, don't worry. You're gonna be happy when we're done. Well, what had happened, of course, was as you've noticed with climate change, what we're getting today is actually more intense rain events that are less frequent, right? You'll get these really intense rain events, and everybody who's growing outdoors knows that these very intense rain events are making it very difficult to grow outdoors now in many areas. And so what you would get is you get these big, huge rain events, and what do you think happens with a hyper intense rain event on an arid soil like that? It hits, the hot soil is capped, the water can't sink in, and it runs off. So what you get is you get this flash flood downhill. By doing what he did, Sepp actually regenerated not just the hydrology, but also started to regenerate the soil. And the soil holds a huge amount of moisture, which means when it rains, it soaks in and slowly comes downhill. So now what's going on is where the people downhill from them had dry stream beds that were dry all year round, except when they had a big rain event, in which case it flash flooded and eroded everything out. Now, everything downhill coming down off of this lake is a beautiful year-round stream. And the riparian zone around the stream is regenerated. Because when rain is hitting the landscape, it's being held and released slowly, like it's supposed to be in natural ecosystems. And when you do that, the ecosystems can regenerate. Again, permaculture techniques to deal with climate change, to deal with desertification, to deal with deforestation. And a lot of these trees that are planted around are edibles, and therefore they're also at the exact same time providing food and fiber and timber for the people in the Tamara region. One other person you may have heard of is Alan Savory, and he actually did not start off being a permaculturist, but his techniques are so systemically minded that permaculture has just like welcomed him in, and we've used his techniques. And it's the same thing. People kind of ask me at times, like, okay, like biointensive gardening, or do you do permaculture gardening, or do you do biointensive gardening? And my answer is, I'm a permaculturist that uses biointensive gardening techniques. That's kind of like, to me, asking an architect if like a new way of designing a kitchen is in competition with their way of doing architecture. It's like, no, if there's a new and better way of doing kitchen design, and I'm an architect doing designs, then I'm gonna love learning these new kitchen design techniques, right? Because they're gonna help me in designing my whole system. And the same thing is true here of what Alan Savory is doing with grasslands and with pasture lands, where he's taking and he's showing how to use, there's a lot of discussion right now about how, cattle are destructive and they're causing climate change and so forth. And what he's showing is that's only true if you manage cattle improperly. If you manage cattle properly, they regenerate the pasture lands, they increase soil organic matter, they repair the hydrology of the land they're on, and they are vastly carbon negative. They actually are one of the very important tools for allowing us to regenerate the soil sky carbon balance and the water vapor balance between the, in the atmosphere, so we can stabilize our climate going forward. He was able to do this. This is a picture from 1963 when people were overgrazing and mismanaging cattle. Exact same season. This is not like wet season, dry season, this is literally the same season, same time of year. And you can see what he did. He's basically regenerated, a fade from the left to the right. You can see he's regenerated a polycultured pasture system that is allowing for the regreening of entire swaths. He's in Africa and in Zimbabwe specifically, and he and several other people I've worked with, including Ian Mitchell-Innes and so forth, have been regreening hundreds of thousands of acres of desertified land across Africa. I could go on with these examples for a long time. What I want to kind of wrap up with is this gives you a little bit of an idea of the breadth of permaculture, of the applications and how it's been applied to, horticultural and systems and so forth. Boy, we could keep on going with examples of how it's being applied in finance, in business, in community structures, in natural buildings, in off-grid power systems, and so forth. One of the things I have been working on is a system of taking permaculture design and integrating it into this whole framework so that I can take whole teams of design professionals, architects, engineers, all of them, horticultural specialists, landscape architects, all of them, and design large-scale systems at the scales of hundreds of millions and billions of dollar systems that are fundamentally regenerative. And I had to create this 9-part framework that holds all the pieces, parts required to do that. And you'll notice that part 6 is called regenerative design methods. And those are the permaculture tools. Those are our permaculture design tools. So that has become a key part of how I'm looking at addressing this problem at that scale, right? So I think with that, I'll kind of wrap it up and introduction to permaculture, and I'll ask just this question, Joe, I haven't been watching the comments. Have there been any questions maybe that we should answer before we wrap up that showed up in the chat? Okay, Joe says we are good. So good, I hope that's been helpful. And with that, we're gonna wrap up the formal presentation.